Welcome to the podcast, Let the Prophet Speak. Today we are going to study the book of Esther, Megillat Esther, chapter 2, Parak Bays. This is Saul Weinreb, the host of the podcast. For those that have been studying Esther with us, we have just finished the completion of the first chapter, in which we learned of the party that the king Ahasuerus made for all of his subjects. We learned that he asked his wife Vashti to appear in front of the assembled people at the party in an immodest way. Vashti refused to do so, and she was therefore removed from her royal position as queen and banished from the palace. Exactly what happened to Vashti afterwards is, at least according to the simple text, is completely a mystery. Many books, novels, and have been written based on what happened to Vashti afterwards. Also, the historic identity of Vashti is also in question, just like we don't know exactly who Ahasuerus was historically. We also, therefore, do not know who Vashti was. There are various theories as to who she may be among the historians and the scholars, but because we really don't know the answer, I'm not going to go into that. Um, just mention one most popular one, that there was a uh, Queen Amestris, who was a famous, powerful queen, married to Xerxes. It was one of the more common um, kings identified as the biblical Ahasuerus. But there's reasons why it might be her, reasons why it may not be. Who knows? The bottom line is, at this point, the king has banished his queen, and now, of course, he misses her. So, Achar Hadvorim Ma'ila, this is verse 1. After these happenings occurred, Kishoch Hamat Hamelech Achashverosh, when the anger of the king, the anger that he had towards his wife for not listening to him when he wanted her to calm down. So Zocharet Vashti, now he remembered Vashti, V'es Asher Asata. He also remembered what she did, Ve'et Asher Nigzar Aleha, and he remembered that which he decreed upon her. So it seems there's three things that he remembered here. He remembered Vashti, in other words, he missed her. He missed um, having her around. But then he also remembered that which she did. Presumably, that leads into him wanting to find a new queen that wouldn't do the same kinds of things, that wouldn't protest the way Vashti protested, that wouldn't have the same streak of independence. And he also remembered that which he decreed upon her, that he will no longer be able to benefit from her company. So therefore, he was upset. It doesn't say specifically that he was upset and sad, but we can see from the next verse, verse 2, that this was the case. Because Vayomer Narhe Amelech Misharsav, the king's young men who served him, said to him, apparently noting that he was upset, Yivakshula Melech, we can find, remember, his attitude towards women was obviously one of complete disrespect, one of someone who did not respect women as autonomous people at all. Um, uh, Unfortunately, typical of the time, especially royals like him. And so what's the big deal? What do you want? You want a pretty woman? We can find young women that are virgins that we can find among the kingdom. We'll search around. We'll find other young women, and you'll be happy again. So the king said, fine, I'll find another woman. So verse 3, Vayafked Hamelach Pekidim, the king then, I'm sorry, this is still the advisor speaking. And the king we can find young women, and the king can appoint officers, b'chol medinot machuso, in all of the provinces of your kingdom. V'ikpitzu et kol na'ara betula, and they will go ahead and gather every young woman, every young virgin woman, Tovat Mara, who is beautiful in appearance, and we will gather them all El Shushan Habira, to the capital Shushan, El Beit Hanashim, bring them into the king's harem, the king's place where the king's women stay. Al Yad Hege Sus HaMelech, and they can, the Hege, who is the king's of eunuch in charge can be in charge of them. Shomer Anashim, he's the guardian of the women of Anaton Tamrukean, and he will give them everything they need to make themselves look pretty. And Bihanara, verse 4, Asher Titav Beinei HaMelech, and the young woman who the king desires, Timloch Tachat Vashti, he can make her the queen instead of Vashti. Vayitav HaDavar Beinei HaMelech, and this appeared to the king to be a good idea. Vayaskein, and he did exactly what they had recommended. So he's going to search through all of his midinot. There's an underlying theme here, which we've seen in the first chapter and in this chapter, the idea of midinot among all of his provinces. And each province had a language, each province had a culture, each province had a history, and so on. But scattered among those provinces were also peoples that did not have provinces. Most specifically, the particular people who we are going to start learning about now, and that is the former exiles of Judea, the people of Israel, who do not have a province. They have a language, a culture, a history, a religion, but do not have a Medina, do not have a province, and are thus scattered amongst the people. And one of those people we're about to learn about in verse 5. Ish Yehudi, there was a Jewish man, Hayab B'Shushan Habira, who lived in the capital Shushan. Ushmo, and his name was Mordechai, ben Yair, the son of Yair, ben Shimei, the son of Shimei, ben Kish, the son of Kish, Ish Yemini. He was a man from the tribe of Benjamin. Now, the verse put out mentioned four generations. Mordechai, the son of Yair, son of Shimei, son of Kish. If he was a fourth generation a Jew living in exile, the forefather of this, the oldest generation mentioned, is a person now by the name of Kish. This tempts one to wonder if this Kish is related to the famous Kish, who was famous in the sense that his son was King Saul. Shaul ben Kish was King Saul's father's name was Kish, and it was also from the tribe of Benjamin. But obviously, that was hundreds of years prior, which would have been much more than four generations. So maybe sometimes when it says the son of Kish would mean the descendant of Kish, which leads to the rabbinic tradition that Mordechai was of somewhat royal lineage, having descended from the same family that King Saul descended from. However, this could also, of course, and the simple meaning of the verse is not that. The simple meaning is that maybe the name Kish was a common name in the tribe of Benjamin, and therefore his great grandfather's name was Kish, and therefore now this person Kish, Asher Hegla Mirushalayim, his great grandfather had been exiled from Jerusalem, Im Hagolah, together with the exile, Asher Haglita, which was exiled, Im Yechanya Melech Yehuda, with the king of Yehuda named Yechanya, Asher Hegla Nebuchadnezzar Melech Babel, that Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, sent into exile. Now, just to remind you, those that have been studying together with me may remember this, but it gets complicated and difficult to remember. So, there were three waves of exile from Babylon, from Judea, that the king Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon exiled. After the death of Yoshiyahu, of Josiah, that when things began to seriously unravel for the kingdom of Judah, there was a king named Jehoahaz. Jehoahaz only was king for several months. He was deposed by the king of Egypt, which was at the time fighting with Babylon for power over the area in the Middle East. And at this point in time, Egypt was on the ascendancy. Egypt deposed Jehoahaz and put a king Jehoiakim into place. Then, after that, so he was a vassal of Egypt. Jehoiakim, who was the brother of Jehoahaz, who had just been deposed by Egypt, so now Egypt is pulling the strings. Jehoiakim then was a vassal to Egypt, and then Egypt fought a big battle, the Battle of Carchemish, against the Babylonians, and Egypt lost the battle. When Egypt lost the battle, the Babylonians then turned to Judah and attacked and laid siege to Judah. This was the first attack of Babylon against Judah, because Judah was a vassal kingdom to their enemy Egypt, who had just been defeated in battle. Jehoiakim um, then, after being conquered and um, after the siege, he capitulates to Babylon and becomes a vassal of Babylon. At that point was the first exile. So Nebuchadnezzar then makes Jehoiakim a vassal to him, and he takes the first group of Judeans in exile. And the most famous member of that first wave was the prophet Daniel from the book of Daniel. After Jehoiakim, so after Jehoiakim became a vassal of Babylon and the Babylonians took in exile, Jehoiakim was loyal for a little bit of time, and then he rebelled again and went over back to Egypt's side, leading Nebuchadnezzar to attack again. During that second siege, Jehoiakim died, and his son Yechaniah, or Jehoiachin, took over. It's the same person, Jehoiachin or Yechaniah took over. They lost the siege again, and Nebuchadnezzar took Jehoiachin and sent him plus many of his many of the noblemen again in the second wave of exile. And two famous members of that second wave was, number one, Kish, the great grandfather of Mordechai that we just mentioned, and we just said he went in the second wave of exile into Babylon. And also the prophet Yechezkel, Ezekiel, who we studied before, was also a member of the second exile that went into Babylon. During that at the same time in the second exile, when Jehoiachin was sent into Galus, the Nebuchadnezzar placed Tzidkiyahu on the throne as a vassal. Tzidkiyahu was loyal for a while, eventually rebelled, and then for the third time, Nebuchadnezzar attacked again. And this time he had enough and destroyed the temple and sent almost the entire people into exile. And that was the third wave of the Babylonian exile. I'm mentioning this so that we can place Mordechai's ancestry. His great grandfather had been one of those that had been in that second wave of exile of Jehoiachin. So, which would have been, if I'm not mistaken, about 13 or so years before the ultimate destruction. So Mordechai then would have been living near the end of the period of the Babylonian exile, close to the time of the rebuilding of the Second Temple, close to the time of the return of the people to Judea, and possibly even, according to some calculations, maybe even during the time when the Second Temple was beginning to be rebuilt. But in the book of Esther, we don't have any direct hints of that, so we have to rely on the different traditions and the different scholars to date it. So just to give you an idea of where Mordechai stood in the history. Now this man, Mordechai, let's continue with the text. In verse 7, Vayehi omein et Hadassah, and he was a foster father. That's my best translation for omein. A young lady whose name was Hadassah. He Esther, who also had the name Esther, Bat Dodo, who was the daughter of his uncle. So she was his first cousin, but apparently younger than him, significantly so that he would become her stepfather. Something had happened to her uncle. She had no father or mother. She was an orphan. And because he was related to her, he took her into his home and raised her as his daughter. She was beautiful in appearance and beautiful and had a beautiful body and form. That's what Yifat Torah generally means. And when her parents passed away, Mordechai took her into the home to raise her, protect her as if she was his own daughter. And it was. This is verse 8. When the word of the king was heard, and his rule and his decree that was heard in the land, that all beautiful young women were to be gathered into the capital, and Mordechai with his cousin Esther lived in the capital. When many young women were being gathered into the capital, Shushan El Yad Haggai, under the leadership of Haggai, who was the eunuch mentioned before. Hatzilokach Esther al Beit HaMelech. Esther apparently had a reputation as being a beautiful young woman, and she was therefore taken to the house of the king, El Yad Haggai Shomer Anoshim, under the hand of Haggai, the one who was the guardian of the women. Hatitav Hana'ara Be'inav. And the woman was pleasant in his eyes. Vatiso Chesed Lifanav. Not only was she beautiful, but she also, the best translation of Vatiso Chesed was she made him feel kindness towards her, or she found favor, she won his favor. So she was not just pretty in a physical way, but she had that kind of personality that made people like her. She had a very pleasant personality, the type of personality that people wanted, that she was able to get along with people well. She did not seem to have that streak of independence, which was that seemed to be Vashti's personality. And Haggai, she just seemed to have a way of people liking her. So Vayivahela Tamrukeha. So therefore, he treated her better than the other women, and he gave her all of her her needs for her makeup and needs to look pretty, Viet Manotea, and her gifts, the Manotea referring specifically to allotments of food and support, Latetla, to give her so that she should be healthy and strong and happy. Beit Sheva Hanarot, he gave her seven young women as assistants, Haruyot, Lasetlami Beit HaMelech, that were appropriate to give her from the king's house. Vayishaneha Viet Narotel, Tov Beit Hanashim. And he treated her women that were there to help her better than the other women in the king's harem. So she earned special treatment, A, because she was beautiful, but also because she was very well liked, and she just seemed to know how to get along with people in a way that people liked her. Lo higida Esther, but Esther did not say et Tamar, her nation, what her nationality was, Viet Molata, and that she was born of the Jewish people. Ki Mordechai tziva Allah asher lo tagid, because Mordechai had um, commanded her and told her, do not say where you come from. So presumably she said she's just a girl from the city of Shushan. She wouldn't say that, mention her Jewish descent. Exactly why Mordechai said that is not clear. It would seem, based on the remainder of the story and the chapters that we're going to be reading, that there was a significant amount of dislike, what we would in modern terms call anti-Semitism, but in those days, clearly it wouldn't have used that term, and it would have been different in many ways. However, there was an amount of hatred or dislike towards people of Jewish descent, and therefore Mordechai told her not to. Now, that again, that is not written in the text, but from the fact that we can see from the succeeding chapters that such a problem definitely existed in those times, one would therefore assume that that's the reason. Now, there's a lot of other traditions as to why he didn't say, or why he didn't want her to say, rabbinic traditions and so on. Each one has its value and has its purpose, but I'm trying to stick as close to the text itself as possible, as I have been throughout these podcasts. So verse 11, U'b'chol yom v'yom, and every single day, Mordechai would go, Lifnei chatzar beit hanashim, he would go outside the courtyard of where the women's harem was, Ladat, in order to find out at Shlom Esther, how Esther is doing. He was the image is being given of a very caring foster father who wants to know about the welfare of of his of his daughter, of his foster daughter, and he is very concerned about her welfare, which is why he told her not to speak about her origins, and also he keeps checking on her to make sure she's okay. He didn't just abandon her when the responsibility passed over to the house of the king. And he wanted to know what's going to happen with her. Hopefully, presumably hoping that one day she can get out of the clutches of the royal household and come back home. Uvahagia, and then apparently of the women that had been gathered from the kingdom, they took turns to spend the night with the king. One can imagine what that night was for, and the king would, once he gets to know all of the women, would then choose the one that he wants to be the queen. So uvahagia tor na'arav na'ara, and when it became, each this is verse 12, the turn of each young woman lavo elamelach Achashverosh, to come to the king Achashverosh. Miketze Yotla, at the time after she had Kedat Hanashim, like the women are prescribed for. This is the practice, I guess, then in royal households was that they would have Shnei Masar Chodesh 12 months. Kikein Yimlu Yimei Merukian. That would be enough time for them to beautify themselves. Shisha Chodeshim Mishem and Amar, 6 months soaking in the oil of myrrh. Vishisha Chodeshim Babisamim, and 6 months in with perfumes and spices, Uvitamrukian Hashim, and various cosmetics. So this was how they prepared. And at the end of that 12-month period, each woman would get her turn with a night with the king. Uvazeh, and in this way, Hana Rabba Halamelach, this is verse 13, the young lady would come to the king, Eiskol Asher Tomar Yinasen La Lovo Ima, and whatever other things she wanted um, to would be given to her. Whatever she said, I want to bring this along or that along. If she had special requests, they would always be fulfilled. Beit Hanashim, the house, the harem, would supply these things ad Beis Hamelach, and she could bring them with her to the house of the king, to the palace. Erev Hiba, she would come in the evening of Aboker Hishava, and in the morning she would return El Beit Hanashim Sheni to another house of the women that had already spent. So they would spend these 12 months preparing in one harem, and then they would spend the rest of their time in the second harem, Eliad Shashgaz, under the charge of a different Sris HaMelech, a different eunuch named Shashgaz Shomer HaPilagshim. Then she would be officially considered a king's concubine, no longer a candidate, but now she's a concubine. Lotavo Od HaMelech, and she would no longer come to the king, only if the king would desire her and call her out by name, he would say, I want that one back. Otherwise, she would spend the rest of her life in this second harem. Uvahagia tor Esther basavichayil dod Mordechai. And when it came the turn of Esther, the daughter of Avichayil, who was the uncle of Mordechai, now he's being named. Avichayil was therefore Mordechai's uncle, who was Esther's father, the one who had passed away. Asher Lakachol Abbas, the Mordechai who had taken her on as a daughter, Lavo Alamelech, when it came her turn to come to the king. Lovik Shaldavar, she didn't ask for anything specific, anything special. This is the sign, it just shows how she allowed the men that had so much power over her and so much power over her to, she just knew how to make them feel as if they were in charge. This is again that little bit of humor, that almost that wink that's behind the text throughout this book. She allowed Haggai to feel as if he was the one in charge. So on the little things that she had control over, such as which perfume to wear or which cosmetics to use, she would allow the eunuch, the king's eunuch who was in charge of her, allow him to think that he was the one that had the control. And because of this way that she had of getting along with people, she found favor in the eyes of all that looked upon her. So the verse here is giving us a hint as to exactly how Esther made people feel like they had control. In a world in which a woman had so little control over her life, Esther learned of a way to get along with people and be well liked. And when push came to shove, when the time came for Esther to assert her independence, we will see how incredibly smart she was in doing that. And when the power was in her hands, when things really meant something, when she had to act, Esther had the power to act because of her very ingenious, very intelligent, and very likable way of getting along with people. Verse 16, Vatilo kach Esther, and Esther was then taken el HaMelech Achashverosh, to the king Achashverosh el Beit Malchuso, to the king's house, V'chodesh HaAsiri, in the 10th month, Chodesh Tevet, which is the month of Tevet, B'shnas Sheval Malchuso, which happened to be in the 7th year of the king Achashverosh's reign. Vaye'ahav, this is verse 17, HaMelech es Esther mikol hanashim. And the king loved Esther more than any of the other women. Presumably, the king had many, many beautiful women to choose from. As much as Esther was beautiful, one would imagine that there were many, many other women that also had the physical characteristic of beauty. Now, here what we see is, why did the king love Esther? It says specifically, "Vatisachen v'chesed lifanov mikol habasulos." She found favor in his eyes, and it was her grace and her kindness that stood her out above all of the other young virgin women that came to see the king. And this is the crucial idea here, is that if he was looking for someone just that was beautiful, he had plenty to choose from. But there was something about Esther's personality that made her the one the king said, "This is the one that I want." And I'm going to venture to guess that this was her characteristic of making the king feel like he was in charge. A characteristic um, that women, when in the societies that they lived in, that didn't have overt power, the women that were so subjugated in a terrible way to the men of the society that they lived in, many women employed this tactic of allowing men to feel like they are in charge. And Esther was a master at this art, making the men feel as if they were in control. Now, I'm saying this because this is exactly what the king did not feel from his first wife, Vashti. So, therefore, Vayosem Keter Malchus Perosha, he placed the crown of royalty upon her head, Vayamlicha Tachat Vashti, and he made her the queen in place of the queen Vashti, who was already banished from being the queen. Vayas HaMelech Mishte Gadol, verse 18, the king made a great party, L'chol Sora v'Avodav, to all of his officers and his servants, Es Mishte Esther, the party of Esther, V'Hanochala Medinos Asa, and in order that the entire kingdom should partake in this celebration, he made a tax holiday, so that the provinces didn't have to pay as much tax. And he gave out gifts according to the generosity of the king. And then he went to gather the when they went ahead, and this is a very cryptic verse here, how this falls in place. And when they gathered young women again a second time, Mordechai Yoshev B'Shar Malach, and Mordechai was sitting in the gates of the king. So now Mordechai was no longer sitting in the place outside the uh, the women's harem, because Esther was no longer there. She was now the queen. She was out of the harem where the women were kept before they slept with the king. Now she is living in the palace, presumably. So Mordechai now moves to the palace in order to check on the welfare of his foster daughter to make sure she's okay. The um the question is, of course, what is this gathering of Betulot again, and how does this juxtapose together with Mordechai sitting in the palace of the king? Why is he gathering virgins again? Well, the king, you can only imagine all various reasons why he would do that. So why is this important to the story? Is questionable and not understood. Maybe I would think, and this is the closest I can come to just using the text and not looking through the various traditions and commentaries and so on, is that it's just pointing out that Mordechai was left, even though they were gathering women again. Mordechai was not in. He was not sitting outside the harem where the women were being gathered because he was involved in that endeavor, right? But rather, even though that endeavor was continuing, Mordechai left that area because only reason why he was there was to check on Esther. So therefore, this just emphasizes the fact that the reason why he was there was to check on Esther, which is why now he changed his place to sit in the gate of the palace. Now, in Esther, even while at verse 20, even when Esther was in the palace of the king and she was the queen and now was wearing the royal crown, she still did not mageret molatav yatama. She still did not say where she came from and what nation she was from. So she maintained this air of mystery about her, kasher tziva aleh Mordechai, just like Mordechai commanded her to. Mordechai Esther osa. And Esther was still loyal to Mordechai, even though she became queen. She did not let it get to her head, so to speak. She still uh, obeyed the command of Mordechai, which was not to speak, and she was still loyal to her foster father who had taken care of her, and to her family, kasher haytav amnaito, just like she was when She was his foster daughter living with him. So this emphasizes Esther's humility. She didn't let it get to her head. She remembered in her heart where she was from and who had sacrificed themselves for her in the past, even while she was the queen of the land. And to finish chapter 2, we now have a little incident that tells us a little bit about Mordechai and what kind of a person he was and how he lived in exile, laying low, allowing the society around him to know and see that he was loyal. By Yomim Mahim in those days, verse 21, Mordechai Yoshev B'Shar Melach. Mordechai is sitting in the palace courtyard, and of course, there's all kinds of intrigue, officials going in and out, people going in and out, all kinds of things to see. And Kotzab Bigton Vasheresh Neser Malach, two of the king's eunuchs got angry at something that the king had done. Mishomrei Asaf. These were guardians of the doorway. So Mordechai was able to hear them because he was sitting in the courtyard where people were going in and out. And they had made a plot to assassinate the king. And Mordechai, being standing around, obviously was quiet enough that he was able to hear them, and they weren't either ignored him or didn't notice him or weren't afraid that he would say anything. Mordechai found out about this plot. Vayaged, and he had his connection. He had connections to the queen. So Vayaged Esther Malka, he told the queen, Vatomer Esther Lamelach b'shem Mordechai. And Esther went and told the king in Mordechai's name. And this is crucial here. Again, this shows her humility. She could easily have said that she heard about it in order to better her position with the king, but that's not what she did. That's not what she did because she had that humility and she said it to the king in the name of where it came from, which was from her stepfather or her foster father Mordechai, and said, there's a man Mordechai who told me this news. Even though that might make her look a little suspicious, why is she talking to this guy? Remember that people don't even know who he is and what their relationship is. But Esther went ahead and said it in the name of Mordechai and told the king about this plot. Vayivukasha Davar, and the king investigated this matter Vayimotzei, and it was found that it was actually true. There was a plot to kill him. Vayitalu Shneim al Eitz, and the two people, Bigtan and Seresh, that had been in charge of this plot, were executed by hanging. Another understanding is Vayitalu, they were hung on wood, meaning they were impaled on wood stakes. Um, it's hard to know exactly what it means. But either way, they were executed. Vayikosev b'sefer divrei hayamim, and then it was written down in the chronicles of the king as an episode that Mordechai had exposed the plot, told the king, and the king's life was thus saved, saving him from assassination. So this completes chapter 2. We now have it set up that Esther is the queen. Esther is the queen, and she's and Mordechai is looking after her welfare. No one knows what her lineage is, what people she comes from, and the king likes her very much, and especially now that she was part of the group of people, in other words, led by Mordechai, that exposed this plot of Bigsan and Saresh. Thank you so much for studying chapter 2 together. Looking forward to studying chapter 3 and, of course, the rest of the book of Esther together.